Chapter 35, Lord Spittleworth's Proposal. A few days later, Lady Eslander was walking alone in the palace rose garden when the two soldiers hiding in a bush spotted their chance. They seized her and drove her away to Spittleworth's estate in the country. Then they sent a message to Spittleworth and waited for him to join them. Spittleworth promptly summoned Lady Eslander's maid, Millicent. He forced her to deliver messages to all Lady Eslander's friends, telling them that her mistress had decided to become a nun. Lady Eslander's friends were shocked by this news. She had never mentioned wanting to become a nun to any of them. In fact, several of them were suspicious that Lord Spittleworth had had something to do with her sudden disappearance. However, Spittleworth was now so widely feared that apart from whispering their suspicions to each other, Eslander's friends did nothing to find her or ask Spittleworth what he knew. Perhaps even worse was the fact that none of them tried to help Millicent, who was caught by soldiers trying to flee the city within the city and imprisoned in the dungeons. Next, Spittleworth had set out for his country estate, where he arrived late the following evening. After giving each of Eslander's kidnappers 50 ducats and reminding them that if they talked, he'd have them killed, Spittleworth smoothed his thin moustaches in a mirror and went to find Lady Eslander, who was sitting in his rather dusty library, reading a book by candlelight. Eslander looked at him in silence. "I have good news for you. You are to become the wife of the chief adviser." "I'd sooner die," said Lady Eslander pleasantly, and turning a page in her book, continued to read. Come, as you can see, my house really needs a woman's tender care. You'll be far happier here, making yourself useful, than pining over the cheesemaker's son, who in any case is likely to starve to death any day now." Lady Eslander, who had expected Spittleworth to mention Captain Goodfellow, had been preparing for this moment ever since arriving in the cold and dirty house. "I stopped caring for Captain Goodfellow a long time ago, Lord Spittleworth. The sight of him confessing to treason disgusted me. I could never love a treacherous man, which is why I could never love you." She said it so convincingly that Spittleworth believed her. He tried a different threat and told her he would kill her parents if she didn't marry him, but Lady Eslander reminded him that, like Captain Goodfellow, she was an orphan. Spittleworth said he would take away all the jewellery her mother had left her, but she shrugged and said she preferred books anyway. Finally, Spittleworth threatened to kill her, and Lady Eslander suggested he get on with it, because that would be far better than listening to him talk. Spittleworth was enraged. He'd become used to having his own way in everything, and here was something he couldn't have, and it only made him want it all the more. Finally, he said if she liked books so much, he would lock her up inside the library forever. "Then I shall die in this room," said Eslander, "or perhaps, who knows, in the bathroom." As he couldn't get another word out of her, the furious chief adviser left. Chapter 36, Cornucopia, Hungary. A year passed, then 2, then 3, 4, and 5. The tiny kingdom of Cornucopia, which had once been the envy of its neighbours for its magically rich soil, for the skill of its cheesemakers, winemakers, and pastry chefs, and for the happiness of its people, had changed beyond recognition. Shoeville was carrying on more or less as it always had. Spittleworth didn't want the king to notice that anything had changed, so he spent plenty of gold in the capital to keep things running as they always had, especially in the city within the city. Up in the northern cities, though, people were struggling. More and more businesses were closing down. The Ickabog tax was pushing people into poverty, and everyone feared being the next to receive a visit from the Ickabog, or whatever it was that broke down doors and left monster-like tracks around houses and farms. People who voiced doubts about whether the Ickabog was really behind these attacks were usually next to receive a visit from the Dark Footers. That was the name Spittleworth and Roach had given to the squads of men who murdered the unbelievers in the night, leaving footprints around their houses. Occasionally, though, the Ickabog doubters lived in the middle of a city, where it was difficult to fake an attack without the neighbours seeing. In this case, Spittleworth would hold a trial, and by threatening their families, he made the accused agree that they had committed treason. Increasing numbers of trials meant Spittleworth had to oversee the building of more jails. He also needed more orphanages. In the first place, quite a number of parents were being killed or imprisoned, and as everyone was now finding it difficult to feed their own families, they weren't able to take in the abandoned children. And poor people were dying of hunger. As parents usually fed their children rather than themselves, children were often the last of the family left alive. And thirdly, some heartbroken homeless families were giving up their children to orphanages because it was the only way to make sure their children would have food and shelter. I wonder whether you remember the palace maid, Hetty, who so bravely warned Lady Eslander that Captain Goodfellow and his friends were about to be executed. Well, Hetty used Lady Eslander's gold to take a coach home to her father's vineyard just outside Jeroboam. A year later she married a man called Hopkins and had twins, a boy and a girl. However, the effort of paying the Ickabog tax was too much for the Hopkins family. They lost their little grocery store, and Hetty's parents couldn't help them because shortly after losing their vineyard, they starved. Homeless now, their children crying with hunger, Hetty and her husband walked in desperation to Ma Grunter's orphanage. The twins were torn, sobbing from their mother's arms. The door slammed, the bolts banged home, and poor Hetty Hopkins and her husband walked away, crying no less hard than their children, and praying that Ma Grunter would keep them alive. Chapter 37, Daisy and the Moon. Ma Grunter's orphanage had changed a great deal since Daisy Dovetail had been taken there in a sack. The broken-down hovel was now an enormous stone building with bars on the windows, locks on the doors, and space for 100 children. Daisy was still there, much taller and thinner, but still wearing the overalls in which she'd been kidnapped. She'd sewn lengths onto the arms and legs so they still fit, and patched them carefully when they tore. They were the last thing she had of her home and her father, and so she kept wearing them instead of making herself dresses out of the sacks the cabbages came in, as Martha and the other big girls did. Daisy had held on to the idea that her father was still alive for several long years after her kidnap. She was a clever girl and had always known her father didn't believe in the Ickabog, so she forced herself to believe that he was in a cell somewhere, looking up through the barred window at the same moon she watched every night before she fell asleep. Then one night in her 6th year with Ma Grunter, after tucking the Hopkins twins in for the night and promising they'd see Mummy and Daddy soon, Daisy lay down beside Martha and looked up at the pale gold disk in the sky as usual, and realised she no longer believed her father was alive. That hope had left her heart like a bird fleeing a ransacked nest, and though tears leaked out of her eyes, she told herself her father was in a better place now. She tried to find comfort in the idea that, being no longer earthbound, her parents could live anywhere, including in her own heart, and that she must keep their memories alive inside her like a flame. Unlike many of the orphanage children, Daisy retained a clear memory of her parents. The memory of their love sustained her, and every day she helped look after the little ones in the orphanage and made sure they had the hugs and kindness she was missing herself. Yet it wasn't only the thought of her mother and father that enabled Daisy to carry on. She had a strange feeling she was meant to do something important, something that would change not only her life, but the fortunes of Cornucopia. She had never told anyone about this strange feeling, not even her best friend Martha, yet it was a source of her strength. Her chance, Daisy felt sure, would come.